Change my shoes. Talk to an imaginary tiger. I don't know. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to week 7 of Advanced Programming with Java. So here's some things that I want to talk about tonight. We'll start off with the Prime Minister's questions. I'm really curious about your experiences with the XML project. We'll spend the beginning of class continuing our discussion about Project 5, the web server. I know we've all been focused on the XML, and so, but this coming week is going to be all about that project, and so I want to make sure that you're well prepared for that. And then sort of after I cover that, we'll be doing some mob programming. So I'm really looking forward to that. Haven't done like real good mob programming in a couple of years because I haven't had this classroom, and this classroom is ideal for that. So we've got 5 stations that we can use. Although the number of people here, we might only need the 4, so it's all good. So, but first off, what can I tell you? What your experience is like with the XML project? Yeah.
Printing, like dumping the XML.
Mm-hmm.
I found out that there's an external library that uses, I guess, they're annotations in Java. I think of them as decorators.
Yes.
But it's JacksBe.
JacksBe.
That's external. So I'm looking at.
Actually, okay, yeah.
Because all the usage that I saw on it was import this main dependency.
Okay.
So I was sitting there looking at the quote standard way to do it because that's what all the documentation had.
That's.
And I'm like, no external dependencies.
Oh, okay.
So I just print lined everything.
Oh, and someone asked about that. Is that? Oh, if you had said JacksBe, sorry, I thought it was like if you had said JacksBe, I said, oh, let's, because I'm curious to see if it can be done with JacksBe. It can? Like you tried it and like.
Well, so you have to make a couple extra custom classes.
Right. Yeah.
Because when you turn a date into those 2 extra
Mm-hmm.
functions, there's no elegant way to do that with just annotations.
Right.
So you just define a couple extra classes and then define how those get turned into XML.
Okay.
And it's pretty straightforward.
So it sounds like you did it, right?
Yes. And I found out it's an external dependency.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Because I mentioned JacksBe in the assignment. I said I don't know if it's going to work, and so let me know. Okay, sorry if you'd reached out. The answer probably would have been yes. But you get to learn about the DOM APIs. So there you go. Right. Put that on your scratch that off your bingo card. Like bucket list. Okay. Cool. And actually, let me know which dependencies that you needed. If you still have like a revision in your GitHub or something, if you can send it to me, I'll take a look because I kind of want. If you want to experiment with JacksBe, I'm not opposed to that because it is like a standard API. Okay. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering, how did you create like the sample valid airline and invalid airline file? Did you type those out or generate those?
I did in the year 2000. I can't remember. What did I do? Oh, I probably wrote it by hand. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Here you go. Younger Dave, more hair. So back then, I'm pretty sure I was using Emacs with like the DTD parser. Yeah, and so I think Emacs helped me write it. And so like it knew what the DTD was, and then they can just say, hey, add an element here. So yeah, I probably did that.
Okay, yeah, because I was just wondering, because like some of the more meaningless like formatting things didn't, they weren't matches. So like when I was doing comparisons, I had to pull it apart piece by piece.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, there was some.
Right. Okay. So like you were like, okay, I'm building out my. So yeah, you're doing test-driven development probably with your parser, with your dumper, and be like, okay, good. Now I'm going to add. I'm just going to have like the flight tag. Great. And then how do you match it? Yeah, that's a.
Yeah, it was like the. It had a couple fields that were different. The valid file or the originals like that you had. The meta information was encapsulated in single quotes, whereas everything in Java wrote was in double quotes. Just little.
Oh, stuff like that. Yeah. Another thing. So XPath is a language for querying XML to say, hey, give me all the elements that descend from airline or something like that. And Hamcrest does have a matcher that I don't know if but that would basically say, hey, go find me all the nodes. So maybe this is another alternative for doing test-driven development with XML. You could just sort of say, hey, it doesn't spit out a conform. It doesn't it doesn't conform to the DTD because there's probably missing required elements and stuff. But maybe you could just use this to match. Huh. Interesting. And so then this is probably it's actually kind of small and hard to read. And so then one of the things I wish Camcrest did a better job of is finding where the static versions are. This is all the instance stuff on the matcher itself. Let's see here. Is it here? XPath. Yeah, there it is. Has XPath. So I guess you give it a DOM object of some sort, maybe a document. Actually, what does it say? No, this is a matcher of a node. Yeah, so a document is a node. Yeah, so maybe do something like that. Huh. Okay, neat. Yeah. So I was pleasantly surprised that there weren't as many questions on Project 4. How did it feel compared to the other projects in terms of approachability, in terms of size and scope?
I found it significantly harder to get started.
Hard to get started. Once you were started,
There were a couple points where I'm just like, what is this? It was mostly, for example, turning on validation and actually getting an error from validation, where that wasn't obvious from a lot of documentation. It took some digging to figure out exactly
how to register the error handler and then handle the error. I mean, like that kind of.
Right.
Yep. Okay.
Defining a custom error handler, turning that error handler on, because there are a couple default ways to parse XML, and you can't use those because it doesn't actually involve the new error handler and the DTD validation and whatnot. That was a pain.
Right.
In a way that the other assignments weren't, because they were just much more straightforward.
Well, and you were doing all the validation yourself,
Right.
right? I mean, so one of the lessons here is that yes, you're offloading a lot of the work to the XML libraries, but you got to understand how to tell the XML library what you want it to do.
Right.
Good. Other observations? Yeah.
I feel like you gave us a lot of information in videos, which were really helpful, but it was also a lot of new information.
Yeah.
Missing. And I think I slacked you with some of my questions that we got the DOM built up, and then I'm trying to parse the XML, and I'm like, what kind of parameter do I need to send in? I'm looking at, my tools and the libraries, and they mentioned like input string, the file, and then I was just totally missing, input source, and then, oh my god, and then you went over it in the videos, and I just missed it. So there were just ways to get stuck.
Yeah. That's a good point. This is probably, the collections API or even like the date APIs, they're kind of small and isolated. And you're right. I think with this, it's probably the largest surface area of an API that you've had to work with all in one fell swoop. That's a good observation. Yeah.
The document has like the configuration exception.
Yeah.
I feel like PDDO, you want to make sure that that exception can happen. But I didn't know how to force that to happen.
The document builder, when it's parsing, it gets a configuration exception, or when you're building a document builder from the factory?
You're doing the whole factory methods.
Yeah.
There's a way to throw some kind of configuration exception, but I did not trigger that for PDD.
Well, that's a configuration exception of like the factory. So I think there was some talk about maybe was it like the indent? No, it was one of the attributes that people were talking about. Oh, I want to format the XML nicely. How do I do that? I think that's the kind of configuration that would throw one of those exceptions, not the errors that you get while parsing XML. So I think it doesn't surprise me that you really couldn't figure out how to break it, and that's okay because you're not really testing the user input, which is the file. You'd just be testing like the internal configuration of your DOM parsing. Good. Well, good. Lots of good learning. That was that's sort of the meta lesson of the XML assignment, because in and of itself, parsing XML, yep, it's a thing. It's good to understand. And in the lecture, I want to tell you about the difference between SAX parsing and DOM parsing and all that kind of stuff. But really, it's just sort of another increment in terms of a more complex library with more things that you need to understand. And it looks like a lot of you got through it pretty well. So congratulations. I take that as a sign that, that you're learning and that you're getting more comfortable doing this stuff. Which is good because you're going to need it going forward. So any more questions on or anything more about Project 4 before diving back into the web application? No? Okay. So as you'll recall, last week we introduced Project 5. Project 5 is you're building a REST API to your airline, and you are accessing that API through a command line tool that looks a lot like the command line tools for your first 4 projects. It does a lot of the same things, but now is doing it by interacting with an airline stored in a web server, a web container, instead of a file of some format. Last time we saw the I've got all sorts of stuff here. Start over again, I guess. We saw how to do unit tests in this environment. Actually, we talked about the environment itself. So one of the challenging things about this project is now you're dealing with 2 Java programs, right? Before it was always like main and then do a whole bunch of stuff and then exit and you're done. Well, now you've got 2 programs. Yes, you still got the main program that does some stuff and finishes, but then you've got your web server, your servlet, which stays around for a long time, multiple invocations of your command line program. And so this means that now, as you implement your logic, as you test your command line tool, there are multiple moving parts all at the same time. Now, last week we looked at what was happening on the server side. We saw this thing called a servlet. Actually, I'll get the code up here. So the servlet is this object that runs inside the web container, and it responds to HTTP requests. And different methods of the servlet are invoked based on which HTTP verb is used. There's a do get for get and a do post, et cetera, et cetera. And we saw how this server-side code interacts with the requests, gets information about it, things that are sent from the client, and then does something with it. Now, out of the box, when you create your project, you get this little toy application which stores a dictionary of words. There are words and their definitions. And as we saw last week, you can populate and query the dictionary via HTTP requests. So what you do in the assignment is that you then modify this application, both the client side that we'll focus on tonight and the server side, to then implement the assignment functionality, which is basically to be a store of multiple airlines. Now, this is a pretty complex, comparatively speaking, this is a more complex project than your projects 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so then it's very tempting to sort of like write everything and then try to test it. But there is a way that you can do this test driven. There is a way that you can write tests for your for both your command line and your server side code using a lot of the tools that you've already learned about. So we walked through this whole example of building. We didn't build it, I suppose. We walked through these unit tests for your servlet. Now, these unit tests are different from the ones that you worked with so far because the servlet API, the servlet for the program uses some APIs, the standard APIs from the servlet API. So things like HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. These objects encapsulate and represent, well, the request and the response. And so they're what your servlet interacts with. But when you test it, you don't want to have to, well, when you test it, it's possible to like start up your web server and hit a bunch of URLs and validate the functionality that way. But that's slow and that's big and that's cumbersome. So we saw last week that we can use this really slick testing API called Mockito to create what are called mock objects that implement an interface like HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response in a way that you can then use these mock objects with your code under test, like your actual servlet, and then send it to them, have the doGet method interact with those objects. It doesn't know the difference as long as something implements the interface. It doesn't care that it's a real servlet request running inside that came from an actual HTTP request or it's one of these mock objects. So your code under test will interact with them, and then afterwards you can inspect your mock objects to make sure they were interacted with appropriately. So that's how you can that's how you can unit test your servlet. Tonight I want to focus on the client side. Now, if you look at so this is the this is like the Project 5 class. So the main thing here, the command line interface is simpler than yours will be. But basically, what your command line program does is it parses the command line, and based on what's in the command line, it makes a request of the server by sending an HTTP request, just like your web browser does, just like curl does. It sends an HTTP request. See, I mean, your web server, your servlet doesn't really care what client. What kind of client interacts with it that sends it requests, as long as it sends a well-formed request. So ultimately, what your Project 5 needs to do is call the REST APIs by making the appropriate HTTP requests. We'll walk through more of it in detail, but I sort of want to give you the lay of the land. The Project 5 is focused mainly on command line parsing. And then what it does is it interacts with something called an airline REST client, which is a class that I wrote to help, or at least I hope helps, do the heavy lifting of interacting with the REST API. For this project, I want to focus mainly on, first of all, understanding the concepts, but then primarily on implementing logic in the servlet. The actual, invoking the URL and handling the results and everything like that is neat, but it just added more overhead to the assignment that I thought was really valuable. And so then what I've done is I provided this airline REST client class that actually does the work of interacting with the, actually does a lot of the work required to interact with the servlet. First, I'm going to demonstrate it, and then we'll spend some time diving into it. And let's see here. I'm going to do this in two, I'll make this a little bigger, in two windows, because we've got two programs running. So over here on the right, oops, come on, there we go. Over here on the right, I'm going to run my web container. I'm going to run Jetty. So, oops, Maven Jetty run. So what this does is it runs the servlet in the web container. Actually, what it does is it starts up the web container and it deploys the project from this Maven project into it. And so now we've got the container running. I'll just do that over here. I'll say localhost 8080 airline. This is that. That's that HTML form that we can use to get information, and so then we can, if we just say what, flights, that returns, this is the dictionary application, right? It doesn't return any words. There's nothing there yet. Over here, I'm going to run the command line, airline web, airline.jar, and it's going to tell me it needs some stuff. So the host is going to be localhost. Port's going to be 8080. The word is going to be doe, and then a deer. So I ran that, and it said, well, it didn't get any errors, so I assume that means everything's okay. We'll go reload over here, and yep, sure enough, when I query the flights, I see that. I can make the same query, I believe, by putting no arguments here. Yep. And I get that same thing back. So what my command line program is doing is parsing the command line and then invoking a REST API, making the appropriate URL request. HTTP URL request to the web server. Does that all make sense? Right? But see, we've got two Java programs that are talking to each other over HTTP. And this makes things a little bit more complicated. So let's see here. I'm going to do the following. So one of the things that this project gives you the opportunity to really start working with is the debugger. I think we talked last time, a lot of you have used a debugger before, but you've probably only debugged one process at a time, right? This is interesting because now we've got two processes that are communicating with each other, and each one is running a Java program, and each one will be at its own point in the code base. And so the way I'm going to introduce you to the client-server communication is by having two Java programs and two debugging sessions. They'll all be in the same IntelliJ though, so it gets a little interesting in terms of which program is actually being run at any given time. So I believe I did this last time, but I'm going to do it again. In IntelliJ, there are these things called configurations, which are configurations for running programs, Java programs in this case. Whenever you run a unit test or whatever, you get one of these configurations created. But there's also another kind of creation called remote configurations, and here's one that we called localhost 5005. Let me go edit it real quick. Hopefully that's relatively legible. And the way this works is that a remote connection is basically, it says IntelliJ saying, hey, listen, there's some Java process running someplace else that is waiting for a debugger to connect to it on a given port. In this case, it's going to try to connect to a JVM who's listening on port 5005, so that once it does connect to it, then it can debug it. Right, and this concept is, well, it's a little similar to what you've probably done with like GDB or something like that. Although there, if you can run the program inside GDB, or if there's a core file, you can attach to it. This is basically just saying, hey, the program's running, and I can connect to it with IntelliJ, a different process, and then they communicate over a socket. Now, in order to tell a JVM that's like, hey, I want you to run in a mode that you can be debugged, there is this big old command line that configures various things. And so I'm going to copy this, and I want this to be used to for my Maven, for my Jetty, which is run by Maven. And so the way I tell Maven, hey, when you launch the Jetty, please launch in debug mode, is that I set an environment variable called Maven ops to have this value. And a couple of things here. There's some configuration. Oops. Oh, jeez. In particular, there's the address. But there's also this thing called suspend. So when you run a JVM in debug mode, you can either have it just like start up and it'll do its thing until someone attaches, until a debugger attaches, or you can say, wait, don't do anything until the debugger attaches. We're going to see that for saying suspend no, which is like, no, start up the JVM, wait for someone to connect. That'll be an appropriate configuration for your web server, right? Because you'll start it up, and it starts up. It deploys the web application. It's sitting there, ready to receive HTTP requests, and that's fine. So let's just quick attach here on port 20.0.0.5 or 5.0.0.5. I will set a break. Well, there's already a breakpoint set in my doGet method. So now when I when I request a URL using the get verb, like when I load a page from a browser, the request was made from the browser to the Java VM to Jetty, but since it was in debug mode, when it hits this breakpoint, everything stops. IntelliJ brings that to the front, and now I'm doing this. Right? We saw this last week. Right? So this is debugging the server side. So I'm just going to continue on here, and then it did its thing, and it returned it. Oh yeah, 0 words because I restarted it. I lost my state. That's okay. So that's one. So now we've got our server sitting there ready to be debugged. Now I also want to debug the client. So I need to then launch the Java VM with the right debug configuration. I'm going to add another configuration. We'll call this 5006, and it'll run on port 5005. Oops. Hello. Oh wait, gotta change this. 5006. And test remote VM. Listen to. What's that? Okay, cool. And how do I change suspend? Maybe I don't. That's fine. I can do it on the command line. So IntelliJ is nice enough to format all of this stuff for me on the right port. I'm going to save that one. I do have both configurations. Oh, I don't. Oops. I meant to make a new configuration. Change that back to 5. Click OK. I'll make a new configuration. Remote, let's see here, I say plus to add. Remote, it remembered. This one, I want to be localhost 5006. And by the way, I'm debugging on localhost, but you can also debug on machines on a different machine. So I mean, there have been times where I've had something running on a PSU machine, and I've attached to it from my laptop. As long as I make the socket connection, the debugger doesn't care where it's running. Which is really nice, right? I mean, so maybe you've got something that only reproduces that environment, or there have been times where I've had to debug things in production, and so then we open up a socket, and I'm sitting there in the debugger trying to figure out, what the crazy thing's going on. So this is the nice thing about Java and the way it's debuggable. You can do it remotely, which is nice because you want to have your code base and your tools all set up on one machine, even if the Java server is running on a different machine. So back to the configuration again. I'm here on 5006. I'm going to copy all this stuff from the command line. And now when I run my command line program, I'm just going to I'm going to append this -agentlib option to my JVM invocation, to my Java command. So this is basically saying, hey, run this Java command with this debug configuration. And here, sorry, I want to say suspend yes. Actually, let me show you what happens if you say suspend no here. Suspend no says, oh yes, go ahead and start it and wait for someone to attach. It sits there and it runs, and it's going to, oops. Oh, sorry, it hit the breakpoint, didn't it? Yeah, that was bad. Yes, yes, yes. I'm gonna detach from this session. What happens when you say suspend no, it runs too quickly. I don't have a chance to attach to the debugger. So what I'm going to say instead is I'm going to say suspend yes. And now it starts, but it doesn't do anything until I attach with the debugger. And so then now I'm going to debug my project 5. I'll just go here to like the first line. And now let's see here. I'm going to attach on 5006 to this. Great. Now I've got that. And by the way, I also want to attach back on 5005, reattach to my web server. In IntelliJ, you have 2 debugging sessions. You have one now on, or I have one, on 5006 and one on 5005. This is going to get a little wacky because, as you'll see, I'm now debugging here in my project 5 code. Here I'm on my command lines. This is the command line parsing. Oops. Hello. How come? Oh, I'm not in the right view. There you go. Okay, here I am. I'm walking through my command line parsing. Pretty exciting. I want to get down here, so I'm going to say run to cursor, or option F9. It's hitting this dumb breakpoint, which I don't like. I'll just say run to cursor. Now it's here. I'm going to set a breakpoint here so we get back to there in future invocations. And so, okay, I'm a little further down in my code. I'm still on the command line. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to now say continue. I'm going to say I'm going to say run, which I guess isn't an option here, but it is. Sorry, I'm so used to the keyboard, I don't remember where all of the buttons are.
If it's on the far left, hit that little arrow with the rectangle.
This thing?
No, over on the other side.
Oh yeah, is this it?
Hold one beneath
That's rerun.
that.
Thank you. Resume program F9. Yeah. So what this basically, Just in case you don't know the fundamentals of debugging, the whole idea is that you can examine each line of code. You can, when you get to a method call, you can decide whether or not you want to step into that code or just step over it. And then you can also say, hey, just like continue on until you hit the next breakpoint. I just want to say continue on until you hit the next breakpoint. So I'm going to do that. And the next breakpoint that's hit is in my doGet method, but this is on the server side, right? So I was debugging the client side, then I went back to the server side. As a matter of fact, I can find out where the client is by going to the client's debugging session, and I can say pause it. Nah, I don't need a decompiler. See what I mean? What it's doing is sitting there waiting on a socket, right? So the client has made the HTTP request, and now is waiting for a response. But this is the cool thing about a debugger, right? You can say, oh, hey, what are you doing right now, right? What code is being executed? And so as you can see, a lot of this stuff is like in the Java.NET API, and okay, so get some URL stuff. But oh, look here, now I'm finally back in my code, right? This is actually that's third-party library code. Here is the code from the project that then goes off and calls a bunch of my code, and we'll step into all this stuff in a little bit. But this is what you can do with a debugger, right? You can pause it, you can inspect it, just figure out what's going on. And this debugging is a skill, and debugging gives you insight, for better or for worse, into all the stuff that's happening. I mean, right? So here, actually, on the client, it's pretty straightforward. We have a handful of threads, but if you go and look what's happening on the server, we've got, what is all this other stuff? Well, this is all the other Jetty stuff that's happening inside your VM. So it gives you the opportunity to really understand where your code, your particular piece of code, resides, or how it fits into the larger picture of what's happening inside your JVM. Here, I want to I'll go back to my main method. Oh, yeah, by the way, this right here is the stack. Hope that's readable. This is the execution stack. So what method calls which method, which calls this method. And so then you can navigate up there to give you an idea of what code is running. So right now, it's calling client.getAllDictionary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint in the line after it, so that we can see what happens when the method returns. So now I'm going to say, hey, keep resuming it, resume the program. It's still waiting, hasn't gotten to the next breakpoint yet, because it's waiting for this call over on the server side to return. So okay, this is cool. Now we can step through all of this. I'm just going to, use step with F8, which I think is, this one is step over, F8. And then we can say step into with F7, which then I was calling a method, now I'm in the body of that method. And so now I can just go through all this and now go up one. And it's done. So now when I say next, it probably sends me off to, Jetty API land, who cares? I'm just going to say continue. I'm just going to say resume. And I did that, and now I'm back on my client side again. I've hit this breakpoint right here. So this is where the complexity comes in this assignment. Now, instead of sort of keeping all your classes in your head, you have to keep all your classes in your head in two separate programs. But this is a very important skill to learn. For me, debugging is kind of the analog of unit testing, right? Unit testing helps you get sort of the fundamentals down and demonstrate all of that, but you also need to know when something really weird happens, something that you didn't expect, and we've all done it, where I try something and I don't understand why it works, then that's when you need to have the debugging skills. You need to understand enough about your code to say, aha, these are sort of this is where I need to shine the flashlight, this is where I need to stop the world and examine what's happening, then in order to figure out, hey, what state is my program in when it gets this unexpected behavior. Okay, and so now I'm just going to continue on here, and you'll see that, okay, our command line program that we ran returned, yep, the server has 0 words. Actually, nothing happened on the server, which is fine. All right, remember, unlike your command line project, unlike your projects 1, 2, 3, and 4, where the tools that you had for communicating with the user were like standard output and standard error in your files, I guess. Now, your server-side code, it shouldn't log to standard output, right? No one's looking at your, at least I'm not looking at your server code. Instead, what I'm looking at is what's returned to the client. And that's where you can use HTTP status codes and of course, the body of the response to communicate back to the user. Okay, so that's how you debug, right? You create these debug configurations in IntelliJ. You run your JVMs with the right command line, with a magical agent lib command line argument so that they're waiting for debuggers to attach. You attach the debuggers, and now you can step through your program. Any questions on that before we move on? Okay, and that'll be an important tool for you to use in this assignment. Now let's look at some more of the code that is that's available here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run. I guess it's sort of the same thing again. We'll step through it again. This time we'll go into a little bit more detail. So now I launched it. It's waiting to attach on port 006, 5006. Nope. There. Attach. Okay. So I parsed the command line, and the command line has a bunch of parameters, the host name and the word and the definition. Notice that the debugger is telling me the values of all of these. So it's passed in as localhost and 8080, and word and definition are null, which is, yep, that's exactly what I passed in. So that's kind of nice. It tells you what the value of those variables are. So now I'm down here, and it creates something called a REST client. So I'm going to step into this just so we can see what the code is like. So an airline REST client. Now the airline REST client extends this thing called HTTP request helper, which is some code off in one of my packages that wraps all of the details of formulating the get and post requests and actually making that of the server. I like to think it helps. If you want to play with the URL class yourself, you don't have to use this. I think this is one of those times where, well, I've intended you to use it so that it's easier. But here again, I'm not going to look at your code. If you want to try to call those APIs yourself, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was kind of curious. I work with Java for 494, and where does the socket objects? Where are they? Are they?
Where are the socket objects? They're all deep underneath the covers. So
within the HTTP request.
Even then, we'll get there. So I'll tell you now, and I'll show you in a little bit. So on the client side, yeah, the socket connection that's being made is buried inside the URL class, I think, or the URL connection class. And then on the server side, the socket is certainly there, but that's something that Jetty takes care of for you, right? All of the socket handling, so all the buffering and all of the reading from it, and then translating it, right? Because this is what the web container gives you: is all this plumbing that ultimately takes in the HTTP request, reads that text off the socket, says, oh, this is a valid HTTP request. Oh, where is it going? Yeah, I'll go look at my table. It goes to this servlet. Okay, create the request object, and call it do get. So, yep, you better believe that underneath the covers there are sockets and stuff, but there's all this abstraction on top of it, which is good because you don't have to write all of that code because you passed CS 494, which I assume is some sort of networking course.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, right. So it's oh, good, I did that in college, and now we'll use the open source tool that people that have got better grades than me in college wrote or whatever. I'm sure they're in the middle of Finland someplace. It's very dark there. Anyway. So yeah, we'll see in a second how all of that works. So airline REST client, basically what it knows about is here's the URL I want to use, and then it's going to do some stuff with that URL. And so it formats that URL by taking the host name and port, which I passed in, localhost and port 8080, and then, well, actually I can just step over this and you'll see the value of URL. Here we go. URL, actually I can probably hover over it. Hopefully it'll be a little bigger. Probably not. So anyway, that's HTTP localhost 8080 airline/flights. That's the URL that we're going to interact with. Okay, so that's created now the REST airline client. The word is null, so what I want to do is I want to return all of the word definition pairs. And so I'm going to call this get all dictionary entries method on my client. Now, the idea of the REST client is the REST client class, the REST client object, is that it centralizes all of the logic for interacting with your servlet. right? We talked a little bit about separation of duties and separation of responsibilities in this class. But the whole idea is that the same code that parses your command line probably shouldn't also be the same code that like formats your URLs and worries about encoding HTTP parameters and everything like that, or URL parameters. Instead, put that off in a separate class, and that class is your airline REST client. We'll also see that by factoring the code this way, it makes it possible and easier to test the client code. So here we are, we've parsed the command line, we've determined that, what we need to do is get all the dictionary entries from the client. So we'll step into that. And so that it does the following. It calls the get method, and with the URL associated with the airline client. So here again, it's the airline flights. Get is a method that is inherited from that, what was the name of the superclass? Helper, HTTP request helper. So what this does is it creates a HTTP get request using the get verb of the server. So I'll step into that. Okay, so this is code that you don't have to write, and that's a good thing because it's the thing that takes care of like forming the URL the correct way and all that good stuff. So the signature of this URL is that it first takes the URL string and then takes a map of parameters, right? URL parameters. So we saw last time that the stuff after the question mark or the URL parameters is these key value pairs. So it'll be like word equals, dough, those kinds of things. And that's encoded here in a map. So then so we're building up this query string, which ultimately is the query that we're going to send to the URL. So in this case, there are no parameters. So the query is going to be empty. If I hover it over it, it's an empty string. So no need to put a question mark there. And now this is where like the socket magic happens. So I'm going to use the URL class. And I'm pretty sure I talk about URL and HTTP URL connection in the lecture. Where basically it's like, okay, create a new URL with that URL, and if something goes wrong, it'll throw some sort of I/O exception. And this is great. I've got the URL, and I'm going to open the connection. And because it's an HTTP URL, I can safely cast it, or I'm going to attempt to cast it to an HTTP URL connection. Because remember, there are lots of other protocols for URLs. And so now I'm going to get that connection. And now I'm going to say, okay, this is basically the connection off to the server. I'm going to say, hey, the request method, the verb for the HTTP request is going to be get. And say, yes, I'm going to interact with it. So I want both input and output enabled. And now I'm going to create a new response object. The response object is another part of this helper class based on that connection. So I'm going to step into that. And so now when we create one of these things, this is the code that actually goes off and then interacts. Oh, it's going to initialize that thing. Interacts with the makes the URL call. So I'm going to call get response code. That's the thing that actually so that API, that's the standard Java API, goes off and calls the server. Great, here I am back on my server side again. I'm debugging my do get. We all know how this works, so I'll just continue. Oops, and now I am on the next line over here. And so get response code, what it returns is the HTTP status code. And so now I say, hey, listen, if let's see here, if it's not HTTP OK, if it's not a 200, then I'm going to get the error message. But in this case, it was a 200. And so what am I going to do? Okay, the URL provided me with its response. I am going to call the get input stream, which contains that response, read it into a buffered reader, and append each line to what I call the content lines. So then that's associated with this response. So I'll go through all of that. Okay, and so that's the content. And so then you can see the content is what was returned from the server. Dictionary on server contains 0 words. And now I've got all of this information in my Java object, in my response object. So I've made the call, I've gotten the response, and now I have this Java object that I can then do things with. So I've got this messages.parse dictionary, which helps with the formatting. You'll use things like your XML parser and stuff like that here. I'm just using this thing to parse all of that. Because what I want to return is the map of dictionary entries. So like I have a very kind of lame REST API in that it only returns human readable stuff. Your REST API will return your XML format, which is a machine readable format, which is much easier to work with. Much easier for the computer to work with. So now I've got that. So my dictionary is empty. So my dictionary is empty. It has size 0 because there wasn't anything on the server. Again, the idea of the client here is to abstract out all of this interaction with the server and basically provide an API that your command line program can use. And so this is a nice separation of responsibilities between the REST client class and your Project 5 main class. So now I'm going to format those dictionary entries that came in that dictionary. That's the message then that ultimately I'm going to print out to the command line. There it is. And I'm going to say system.exit. So for me, one of the ways I like to interact with, to work with this code base is through debugging, right? Is to sit there and sort of understand what all the moving parts are. It sort of lets me like stop the world. That way I don't need to add like a ton of debugging or try to figure out, okay, wait, when this line was printed out over here on my client, what was happening on the server? Right? Debugger is, it'll take a little bit of getting used to and figuring out, but ultimately it's a much better investment of your time. Want to pause here? Any questions about what you just saw? Okay. It's important to remember the separation of responsibilities between Project 5 and the airline REST client. Because what you'll be doing in your project is you'll be modifying the airline REST client to, instead of handling this word definition map, it'll be working with, I recommend that you have it return your flights and have it return an airline class, everything based on what you instance of airline based on what was returned from the REST API. Okay. So that's how you debug it. How do you test this? Right? How did you test your command line code in projects 1, 2, 3, 4? Integration testing. Now, remind me again what the difference between unit testing and integration testing is, because you both use JUnit, right? So why do we make this distinction between unit testing and integration testing? Someone other than you. Shall we?
Unit tests are very short, small tests, like run test components of the program. Integration tests are doesn't work from A to B or between classes.
Right, is the scope of the test, right? So unit test is for units, it's a single class or a single method, or maybe it's a couple of classes interacting. Integration tests are larger. I like your end-to-end tests. You're like, hey, I'm like doing a whole thing, not just a piece of a thing. For your REST application, what do you want your end-to-end tests to do? What do you want your integration tests to do? Those are actually our unit tests. There was the unit tests that use the mocks, right? Because that's nice, because you don't have to stand up any of the, I may have gave away the answer. What were you going to say for the integration tests?
Saying testing third parties.
Right, is testing, well, in this case, it's the third parties like actually having your web server running, right? So in your integration tests, you want to test the actual REST API running. Because your command line program, I suppose you could mock out, you could have a unit test that mocks out the REST API, but really what you want to have your integration test is to actually have your REST API running in Jetty, but then maybe exercising it via an automated test. So we've got that. Tomcat, Maven and Jetty make that pretty straightforward. So the way this Maven project works is that Maven verify. Let's see here. I'm just going to. I'm going to stop that server. Now I'm going to say Maven verify. Oops. Maven W verify. What Maven verify does is it does all the stuff that it usually compiles the compiles the code, compiles the unit test, runs the unit test. Now it runs the integration test. I have Maven configured so that when it runs the integration test, what it does is it starts up Jetty and deploys the web application, deploys your REST API, and then it runs a series of tests that actually hit the REST API. And those tests exercise some of the classes that you've already seen. So let's have us take a look at all that stuff. So here in my integration tests, I have an airline REST client integration test. So here, and this is another thing that I like about having this airline REST client class, is that you can exercise it in isolation. And so you can just call the methods, call its methods, and then inspect its results, and you don't need to worry about all of the parts in the command line and things like that. So if I were to do this test-driven, I think what I do is first I would unit test the I don't know. Would I do it in thin slices? I might do it in thin slices. That's probably the best way to do it, right? So say, hey, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the get when there's like no parameters to just return, like a built-in empty airline or something. And then make sure that that works in your unit test. Then make sure that it works in your airline REST client integration test, and then make sure it works in your command line. And start build from there. Maybe? I don't know. Your POAs are due in a little while. You can tell me how you go about doing it. Anyway, so what we're looking at right now is the integration test for the REST client class. So this isn't the command line. This is just that REST client class that makes the calls, the URL calls, off to the server. Interesting thing to note here is that normally we want our unit tests to be idempotent, meaning they don't have any side effects, meaning that they don't leave anything behind that other subsequent tests would trip over, or because it allows you to run your tests in any order. We don't have that luxury here because for this test, we start up the server will start, and then we run these tests, and will these tests do things like, hey, I'll define a word. Well, that definition is still there, persistent in memory. I suppose we could clear the dictionary after every test, but instead I decided to show you, hey, here's how you can test stuff in order, which means you can have later tests depend on earlier tests, which, I don't know, it can be a good thing because it's more efficient. It can be a bad thing because your tests are interdependent on each other, and so if something goes wrong upstream, it can cause funny test failures downstream that aren't obvious to debug. Anyway, so let's take a look at one of these tests. So like the first one, it calls remove all dictionary entries, which actually clears everything out from the server. This isn't necessary for the command line tool, but boy, does it make testing easier. So this is so test one here says, hey, listen, when there's an empty server, make sure it contains no dictionary entries. So I'm going to create myself the airline REST client. I'm going to call get all dictionary entries. I'm going to make sure that the dictionary returned to it has 0 size. So now if I run this test, oops, class not found. Oh, yeah, okay. It's got one of these deals. This is one of those times where somehow the IntelliJ project and the Maven project get out of sync. So I'm just going to clean there. I think it'll run better now. Yep, it fails because it said connection refused. Oops, why did it fail with that? The server is not running. Oh yeah, first thing you gotta learn, right? So now, because here again, right, it's not like in Project 1 where it's like, great, everything was just there and it would all run. Nope. Now you've got to run your server when you want to run your tests. Nothing wrong with that. So now I'm going to run the Jetty. Okay. And I'm going to rerun this. I hope that it works okay. Yep. And now it passed. So it went off and it ran and it said get all dictionary entries equal to 1. Okay. Now I'm going to run this other test, which is define one word. So what does it do? It creates a new airline REST client, and actually, let me just take a look at that. Airline REST client, it sets it on a given host and port. The port is configurable via a system property. That's neat. So it always tests on localhost. But now I'm going to run the second test here. What it does is it invokes the add dictionary method. To add dictionary entry method with the word and definition. Then it goes and gets the definition for that word and asserts that, yes, the definition for that word is what it expects. So I'll run this now. It passes. Well, let's say it didn't pass. What do you do here? Well, you can debug this. So in IntelliJ, you can debug a test. You can run a test under debugger by saying debug like this. And so now you can do the same thing that you did whenever you that you can if you attach to a remote JVM. You can step into and you can say, okay, great, I'm creating my new airline client. I've got word and definition. Now I'm going to add a dictionary entry, and so then I can step into this. This uses a post method. I'm not going to dive into a lot of details, but I think what I will do is I'll make sure that I'm debugging my server, which runs on 005. Actually, I'm going to rename these so that it's a little easier to remember which one's which. 5005 is Jetty web server. And then 5006 is command line app. Okay, I'm going to attach to that. And again, I've got two debug sessions. This first one here is my unit test. It's got the name of the unit test there. The second one here is my web server. I'm going to make sure that my servlet does have a breakpoint there. Now let's go back to this. Okay, so now if I step over this, now I did a post, so now it stopped in the doPost method of my server. So I'll just continue on here. Of course, it doesn't bring me back to this next line. There's a method called throwException if not OK HTTP status. And so this is, again, on the client side. So if I go into this, it basically says, hey, what was the code returned from the response? If it's not OK, I'm going to throw something called an airline REST exception. So again, what the REST client does is it wraps all the calls to the REST API in a Java API, because your command line program is going to be much happier working with a Java API than it is trying to make all these HTTP calls. So it wraps all of that stuff in Java-isms. Like, hey, when something goes wrong, well, you don't return like an integer to say something went wrong. No, you throw an exception. And so here, we've got an exception that that might get thrown when something goes wrong. Okay, so now I'm debugging, and I'm going to end up back in my test code. Oops, which then calls get, which now goes back to my server. And now when I continue on from that, here I am back in my test. And it got test definition, which is what it expected, so it'll pass. Now, my Jetty server is still running. And so I can do things now like just hit the API. I'm going to reload that page. Of course, I'm going to hit the debugger because I made a request. But now, yep, there it is, my test word, test definition. So this is kind of different from what you've seen before. I suppose in projects 1, 2, 3, and 4, persistence, meaning data lives beyond the invocation of one of your command lines, was implemented with your files, right? Everybody's first question on project 1 was like, wait a second, how come it doesn't do anything? I create some data in my program and it all disappears. That's true. Project 2, what did you do? Okay, great. You started persisting out the information provided on the command line into files. And you did that for projects 3 and 4 also. Well, now in project 5, you're persisting information in a web server. So this is how the data lives beyond the invocation of your command line. So here's so through this airline REST client IT, you can test your you can test your REST API using Java code because you have this REST client object that encapsulates all those calls off to the REST API. And finally, there's also a Project 5 integration test, which is what our old friend invoke main. And this thing does sort of the similar things to the REST client integration test, but it exercises the command line, right? And so using invoke main, and you can give it just the host and the port, and then you can make sure that the right stuff was written out to standard output and standard error. So I expect and so then you can write tests for your web application. As a matter of fact, you must write tests for your airline application because I have configured the project to support the -p grader. -p grader, and then verify this, and so then I have it configured so that Jacoco will evaluate your code coverage, and again I have a minimum threshold of 60%. And actually, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that just out of the box, the little toy application I have right now, I believe it has sufficient code coverage. If it ever ends, things take a lot longer. Yeah, so it says, yep, all coverage checks have been met. I think it's something like, it's something like 80% or something out of the box. So, I think so an interesting thing that one of the things I'm curious about is your experiences then writing tests for this now distributed application. Okay, so that was a lot, but those are some of the fundamental things you'll need to know about your Project 5 and how to work with it. Any questions? Yeah?
How does Jacoco know to run the Jetty server in the background for running some of your tests?
Jacoco, that's a very good question. So has it know to run the Jetty server? Actually, it's Maven that launches the Jetty server, and I'm pretty sure that the code coverage is only measured on the command line side, which means that yes, you really do need to have unit tests. So remember, there's two passes for Jacoco. There's your unit tests and your integration test. So your servlet must be covered by the unit tests, and then your project 1 and your client side code, so your main class and your REST client class must be covered by integration tests. Good question.
It's saying it's covering 6 classes.
Yep.
But I only count 4 non-test classes.
Might be inner classes. Let's go look at the report. Good question. Target site, Jacoco, and I still haven't gotten around to creating a merge report. I apologize. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so there's like airline REST exception and then this new map.entry class. I don't know what it is, right? Yeah. So actually, that's in the messages class. We'll probably take that out. But yeah, so it's the 6 classes that it's looking at. Okay. This assignment is due in a couple more, March 4th. So that's 2 more weeks. Yeah, that sounds right. 14 days. February 33rd. Yeah, March 4th. Okay. Okay. Anything else on Project 5? No. Okay. Let's take 10 minutes. I'm going to go upstairs and get some of the cables and stuff, and then we'll do some mob programming.